Joe Hopkins here. What is good tone? That's what it says. What is good tone? We're guitarists. We care about good tone. Is there such a thing as good tone? My personal favorite tone is the one your sister makes when I'm knocking the bottom out of her. But that might not be your favorite tone. You probably don't want to hear that tone. You don't like it because you love your sister and you don't want bad things done to her. All right, so is there such a thing as good tone? Now, this is something that's argued about a lot. I mean, a lot. Like, there are endless videos on YouTube here about what's good tone, how to get good tone, how to make your guitar sound better to get that tone, or how to get certain tones. So I'm going to go over my thoughts on what is good tone, and I'll make it plain and simple here. Good tone is what it is you like, what works for you. And I'll give some examples here. The Kinks. Does anybody remember the Kinks? They came out in the 1960s, and they had their guitar tone for that time would be considered horrendous, horrible. But it's a tone that really worked for them, and a whole generation of punk musicians spent all their time trying to copy, right? Everybody seemed to want that tone after a certain point. And speaking of those punk musicians, they had what would have been considered terrible, awful tone, but it worked great for what they were doing, right? You look at Lemmy from Motorhead. Yeah, that's bass, but dude, that tone is horrendous. That's horrible. That's just literally crank up all the mids and make it sound as angry and muddy as possible, basically. Which, there, it's still recording. I wasn't sure, man. It looked like it stopped. Anyway, like, Lemmy's tone is arguably horrible, but it sounds great in the songs he's using it for. Listen to Blizzard of Oz sometimes, right? Randy Rhoads. If you can ever hear, I've heard his guitar just singled, right? Just cut out of the mix, just the guitar. It's thin, and it doesn't sound that great. But then when you put it in the mix, it sounds absolutely spectacular. You know, why is that? Well, it's because you want your guitar quite often to fit well, to sit well in a mix with other instruments. I've run into this myself. I've made some terrible recordings here and there, done some terrible stuff, and what I've learned, you get your guitar to sound really great by itself, and then when you put other instruments with it, it doesn't always sound so great, right? The instruments get in the way of each other. The guitar's, it's got too much bottom end. It sounds, oh man, when you're playing it by itself, that sounds so full and fat. And yeah, but then it gets mixed in with the bass and the drums and not so much, right? Or you'll mix it in with keyboards and all of a sudden parts of your guitar work kind of disappear. You want it to sound good in a mix, which isn't always how it sounds good by itself. Right? So if you're playing guitar by yourself, you might want it to sound one way. If you're playing with other musicians, you might want to thin it out in some areas. You know what I mean? You don't want it to get muddied in with the bass, and you don't want it to disappear into the keyboards. Or sometimes you do. Sometimes when you're mixing guitars, you kind of just want that wall of rhythm. So you might mix them a little on the low side or a little muddy so that they kind of mix in with the bass, especially like 7 and 8 string guitars. I've noticed a lot of the metal bands that use that stuff, they'll double track guitars or even, track them 4 times. So you just get this big, massive sound and they're mixed right in with the bass so that it's all kind of together as one rhythm track. And that can work really good. But it begs the question, what's good tone? And it changes. The idea of what is good tone, let's be honest, it changes over time, right? In the 40s and 50s, like the early days of electric guitars, they wanted that nice, clear, crisp, crystalline sound, right? Especially like with jazz and stuff, and playing all the chords. And they wanted a nice, crisp sound, right? 60s come along. Well, even before that, with rock and roll, a lot of them are kind of driving the amps a little hard, so you get a little breakup. I mean, this is before distortion. But that sound would have been considered horrible 5 years earlier, but all of a sudden rock and roll starts getting big, and that kind of overdriven, angry, loud sound is the thing. You know, you get up into the 60s and now distortion becomes a thing, and they're finding, you know, people are finding any way they can to really drive that amp into distorted sounds. By the 70s, you've got distortion pedals and all these different ways to make distortion, and now they're trying to figure out how to put, you know, compression and delay and reverb on this stuff to really give it that aggressive rock and roll tone. While at the same time, you got a lot of pop artists and folky artists and stuff like that, jazz kind of going back toward clean again, you know? And then in the 80s, it's a totally different kind of tone. Everybody's using overdrive pedals and, you know, wahs and all that kind of stuff. And that's the big thing now. By the 90s, you know, well, needless to say, what is good tone changes over time. So if you want good tone, what sounds good to you? Now, if you're just playing around with the guitar for your own amusement, you're not really playing with other people, you don't have to worry about how it sounds in a mix. Fiddle around with your amp. Find something that you like, right? Try some different pedals. Find something that sounds good to your ears, that kind of inspires you, and play around with it, right? If you do play with a band, or you write songs, or you record, you have to start fine-tuning your tone so that it really works well with other instruments. You know, and it depends on what other instruments you have. Are you using a synth bass, or do you have a bass player, right? Are you using a drum machine, or do you have a drummer? And how does your particular guitar tone fit well with those other instruments? Is there a keyboard player? Do you play in a band with horns? You might have to tweak your tone a little bit to really work well with the horns. And it can help if you have somebody with good ears that can sit in the audience and or sit where the audience would be before a show and help you with that. Kind of tell you, hey, your guitar is kind of getting lost in the bottom end a little bit, or it's kind of mixing in with the keyboards. You might want to give it a little more high end or a little more mids, or, you know, change this setting or that setting. It can make a pretty big difference, right? What's good tone depends on the situation and the sound you're going for. If you play with a punk band, maybe you kind of want that, depending on what kind of punk it is. You go in old school, maybe you want a clean amp that's just turned up too much and the mids are too high, so it gets kind of like that angry, pissed off kind of quacky sound. Maybe you're with a metal band and you want, you know, a lot of real heavy distortion and a lot of overdrive. Of course, a lot of them newer metal bands are turning down the distortion. They're not pushing the overdrive as hard, and they're going cleaner and getting really heavy tones that way. And that could be really cool too. But you got to play with it. You got to tweak it, and you got to find what works for you in the situation you're in. Because what is good tone really changes over time. Everybody has their own opinion, and you're going to have your own opinion. My opinion is there really isn't any such thing as a bad tone. It's just you can use a tone badly, I would say. If you're using something that sounds good in this context and it doesn't in that, then you gotta do it differently depending on what you're doing and who you're playing with. And I mean, let's be honest, right? Everybody's situation is different. Everybody's tastes are different. So find the tone that works for you. Seriously. And that's another reason why we like budget stuff on this channel, so you can afford to buy a cheap amp or that still sounds good, or amp sims. Amp sims are great because you can have a bunch of them on your computer, and without spending a ton of money, try just hundreds of different sounds. Pedals can be great. In fact, to change the tone, I'd say some of the best things you can get are a wah-wah pedal, because you really can't get expression pedals on your amp sim. You can, but you can't work them the way you can. You know, you need that foot pedal. You really need to be able to make it work with your foot. Volume pedals can work good too, because you can make the volume go swell and go back down and give it an interesting sound. You know, things like that, you know? But hey, experiment, try out some things, find out what tone works for you. And especially in the context you're using it in, and make that your tone. All right, so that's my thoughts on it. That's my little rant, just kind of a rant on tone. And man, I'll see you guys in the next video. Here, subscribe to my channel in a minute here. There's gonna be some playlists come up. You can check out reviews and songs. Listen to some of my songs. Tell me if my tone is any good. You know, I kind of make it sound the way I like, but you know, somebody's gonna tell me your tone is crap. But I like it. So anyway, I love you guys. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out, baby. Bye-bye.